When 24 hours turns into 100 days, Donald Trump now literally begging Vladimir Putin to stop the war in Ukraine and admitting he may have been played by the Russian dictator all along. Welcome to the No Spin Zone. Graphs Grievances starts right now. Just over 3 years ago, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, a democratic nation on its western border, 28 times smaller in landmass and with only a third of Russia's population. Given those dynamics, most military analysts predicted Kiev would fall within days, and authoritarian Russia would quickly overrun the former Soviet Republic. They were dead wrong. Thanks to billions in support from the US and Europe, Ukraine has not only defended its territory heroically, but also exposed the supposedly mighty Russian army as a paper tiger. Yet despite Ukraine's resilience through 38 months of brutal warfare, Donald Trump and his complacent Republican allies in Congress have now decided to cut off funding for Ukraine's fight. Since the invasion began, the U.S. has allocated just over $180 billion in emergency funding for Ukraine and the region. Of that, $83 billion has actually been spent on aid and equipment. That may sound like a massive amount, but remember, no U.S. troops are fighting in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a democratic ally, while Russia is an authoritarian regime led by a murderous dictator bent on redrawing Europe's borders. And if Putin succeeds, who's to say he'll stop there? That's why former President Joe Biden has framed this war as a proxy battle between global democracies and authoritarian regimes. Donald Trump, of course, sees it very differently. Since announcing his campaign to return to the White House after losing in 2020, Trump has promised he'd end the war in Ukraine on day one of his presidency.
End the war in Ukraine in 24 hours.
Yes, I could.
How would you do that?
I know Zelensky very well.
I'll end that war between those two countries in 24 hours. It won't even take that long. I will get the war ended. I'll stop all of those lives from being wasted and lost. And there'll be no more bombing of Ukraine. There'll be no more bombing of Russia. And everybody will be happy.
It can be negotiated, I think, within 24 hours. It really has to be done from the office of the president, which will guarantee that this war will end immediately.
And that to get it solved, I can do it in 24 hours. I know both players, and I can do that in 24 hours.
Have a deal done in 24 hours from the time we started.
Well, here we are, 100 days into his term, and the war rages on. Why? Because Trump underestimated both Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Trump buying into his own myth as a master deal maker, believing peace would happen just because he said so. That fantasy didn't survive contact with reality. Trump offered Putin nearly everything he could want, and just listen to this list. Ukrainian territory, sanctions relief, a public promise of absolution for the invasion, a gutted Voice of America, defunding of the National Endowment for Democracy, halted U.S. cyber operations, and the dismantling of efforts to fight disinformation, election interference, sanctions violations, and even war crimes. Trump's administration also offered Putin shutting down the task force seizing Russian oligarch assets, freezing a project tracking Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, and pulling out of an international group investigating Russian war crimes. He even paused cyber operations targeting Russian aggression. And after all of that, Putin still refused to make peace. Now, 100 days later, Trump is starting to realize he's been played. On April 26th, he posted, quote, "It makes me think that maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me all along and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions." Ya think, Donald? Too bad it took 100 days and a mountain of concessions for that to finally click. As for Zelensky, Trump also miscalculated badly. He assumed the Ukrainian president could be pressured into surrendering land and sovereignty no matter the deal Trump cut with Russia. But Zelensky rejected a White House proposal that would have the U.S. recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, legitimize Russian control over territory seized since 2022, and even block Ukraine from ever joining NATO. Zelensky said no, because to him and to millions of Ukrainians, freedom and national survival aren't up for negotiation. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Trump met with Zelensky this weekend in Rome during the Pope's funeral. It was their first meeting since that tense Oval Office showdown in February, where the two clashed on camera over Trump's growing tilt towards Moscow. This time, the tone was reportedly more civil. After meeting, Trump posted his doubts about Putin's intentions and called out Russia for, quote, shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities, and towns. So, has Trump finally woken up to the reality of this war? The war he consistently refuses to blame on Russia, the country that actually launched it? That remains to be seen. What we do know is this. The Trump administration is now threatening to walk away from peace talks altogether if it doesn't see progress immediately. Over the weekend, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Trump would decide this week, whether to keep negotiating or move on to, quote, other matters. And that would be a catastrophic mistake for America, for Ukraine, and for the democratic world. Because without a deal or U.S. support, Ukraine will likely not be able to hold out much longer. And if Ukraine falls, Putin doesn't just gain land. He gains power, credibility, and momentum. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about whether the world still draws a line between freedom and tyranny, and whether the United States will stand firm with its allies when democracy is under fire. Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours. 100 days later, all he's done is weaken Ukraine, embolden Putin, and expose just how little he understood the stakes from the start. And now, with no peace, no victory, and no plan, America is left asking, what exactly was the strategy, Mr. President? Thank you for watching Graf's Grievances. Let me know what you think. Please like, subscribe, share, and join me tomorrow for more.